is a first time for everything. A first kiss, your first car, the unrequited first love. However, what does this mean in the grand scope of things? Are firsts more monumental because they are the first, or do we get better with practice? Do we remember our firsts as more important than they actually were, holding on to that magical moment as a mark of our past and future selves? Do our firsts outshine what comes next? On A First Time for Everything, we will explore with our guests their firsts and how those impacted the seconds, thirds, and even countless times after. Is the first the best or merely the beginning? Or worse, was the first the last because it was so bad? We will dig into the recesses of our memories and consider whether or not a first was the start of something amazing or something we'd rather not remember. Come along with me, Juliet Rose, as I put our guests in the hot seat to analyze their first and how they defined who they became. I promise you're in for a fun, although maybe bumpy ride. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of First Time for Everything. I'm your host, Juliet Rose, and we appreciate you tuning in on a kind of off day. Unfortunately, I couldn't do it last Thursday, so Brian was kind enough to meet me tonight and chit-chat, so yay. And just to remember, set a star to let us know how we're doing here at Go Indie Now, and every time you contribute, get entered into our season prize package drawing with gift cards, swag, and more. And again, tonight we are talking to, and his name is Brian, just in case anybody doesn't know how to pronounce it, Grover. And actually, Brian and I met through a horror group, and then we became friends online. He's actually one of the authors in our upcoming anthology, Devour the Rich. So I was actually recently just working on this because I'm doing some of the editing and formatting, and I was reading your story, and yeah, I had a good time with that. So, Brian, why don't you tell our viewers a little bit about yourself, what you write, and where they can find you?
Hey, Juliet, thanks for having me. Pleasure to see you again. Bryn Grover, that's the name. I know it looks weird, B-R-Y, with the fada mark in an N, but that's how it's pronounced. I am a writer of multiple genres like Juliet and a bunch of others that she's had on the show. I think my primary focus really is horror, and unlike Juliet and others that have a lot of full-length novels, I kind of focus on short stories because my brain's all over the place, like, oh, squirrel, I'm off this way, I'm off that way, so I got things going on all the time. So my books are mostly a collection of short stories, hence I have a short story coming up in Devour the Rich, and in some other anthologies. But I also write poetry, which is the majority of it is romantic and for my wife. I'm not a handyman. I'm zero use with cars, roof repairs. That's not me. My love language is writing poetry for my wife. So that's the majority of what I do. Although this year I did release a book of horror poetry called Catacombs. So that's kind of what it is. I have my own website. It's quillgroupllc.com, but it's easier just to find me on Facebook at, Bryn Grover Author or Brian's Quill. Both of them will find it, as long as you spell it without a vowel, B-R-Y-N. Brian's Quill or Bryn Grover, and you'll be able to find me there. So, I mean, the picture that you have there is called the Golem. That was the first one. And since you're talking about first, that was the first book of horror short stories that I put out. Although there is like a fantasy one in there and maybe a vampire-ish, comedy-ish one kind of thing in there. But that was the first one. And on your intro, you were talking about, was it an amazing start or was it something you'd rather forget? And I think this is both. I don't know if you've ever had that feeling with a book, like, yay, this is so awesome, and then like, this is the worst piece of crap about.
I think most writers feel that way.
So I was happy with it. I was happy getting it out. I mean, and I was encouraged by another writer who's fairly successful, totally different genre, but he helped push me into it. Of course, my wife has been pushing me for years. So, I finally went ahead and did it, and he hooked me up with somebody to do the cover, but I didn't have a good editor. That's where my problem is with this book. And the editing was bad, and I actually trusted that they knew what they were doing. but they didn't know what they were doing. So from an editing perspective, this is the worst one. I still stand by the stories, but the editing is where I'm like, God, this is horrible. And it has
Now,
my name. It has my name on it.
have you considered, I mean, it's obviously still out. Have you considered having, going back and having somebody re-edit it and then re-release it?
Actually, it's not out anymore.
Oh, okay.
Because, and I am going back and working on the stories now. And I met through just the same as I met you and a whole bunch of other great people at horror shows. I've met a lot of authors, and I've started asking people, who are you using for an editor? Because here's the problems that I've had for some of the ones I've had in the past. And I just recently hooked up with somebody that did a short story for me. Like, they would do like 1,000-word kind of thing for free. So I had this one really short flash fiction thing that was maybe 900 words that I said, well, let me give this to her. Her thinking and editing was perfectly aligned with what I was trying to do and write. And I'm like, this is the person that I'm going to move forward with, So the Golem, like revision 2 or edition 2 or whatever, it'll be redone with new stories, but with good editing.
Yeah, and I can't express that enough. I think a lot of people think someone's an editor, they're good at anything. And I think you got to really find the right editor for your voice. And not everybody, even if they're an amazing editor, is right for you, simply because they may not understand your voice and they may try to change that too much or focus too much on the things that really don't matter. So I think it is really important to find that person that kind of just meshes with your style. So I noticed you're about the same age as me. You're probably close in age as me. So obviously,
I'm a lot older than you, young lady.
Yeah, I don't think you are.
I think so. I mean, like I have a date coming up next week with my 18-year-old granddaughter in college.
Yeah,
I'm a lot older than you.
All right. So I'm in my 50s, but we'll say, okay. But going with that, obviously, are you coming back to writing later in life? Have you always written? Are you kind of just discovering this? Or really, where did you start your writing journey?
It's a good question, and I don't even know how to answer it exactly. I think the oldest extant piece of writing that I have is a poem from 1968 that was written for some cute girl down the street, right? That's the oldest thing that I actually have written. So I've been writing off and on forever, but I don't think I started getting into writing like harder. I mean, that was like when I was 8 years old. Probably in my 20s, I started writing more. And it had a lot more to do with depression and things going on in my life. And it was kind of an outlet, if that makes sense. And then in my mid 20s, I was in the service and had an injury, traumatic brain injury that kind of changed me in a lot of fundamental ways. And it had a lot of depression. And I don't want to get into some sob story, but there was a lot going on that I was trying to release a lot of that stuff in writing. So, my writing style kind of changed a little bit from more of a fantasy to more of a horror-ish kind of bent, if that makes any sense. But I was still just doing it really for me. My wife was pushing me. You like to write, get in your office and write. Go write, go write, go write. I mean, she's, God bless her, she's a godsend, and I wouldn't be doing this without her. But I also, like I said, I had a friend who had started publishing, and he said, this isn't as hard as it looks. He said, here, let me teach you about CreateSpace. I don't know if you were using that before.
I haven't. I heard of it. Yeah.
Yeah, before KDP took it over. I mean, it's kind of almost the same thing. They changed it, and I think a little bit for better. But he's like, go through all this, and he's the one that hooked me up with the first guy that did that first cover. So, but I think I've been writing since I was at least 8.
Wow.
But I didn't get serious until I was in my 20s, and now I'm 65. So, I think it's probably, that book's probably 9 years old at this point. So I guess the last 9 years or so, it's been a little more active. But, we have a special needs adult son. Both of us work full-time jobs, trying to pay down medical bills. Writing was an afterthought. It wasn't the first thought. I want it to be a first thought and a first source now, but and I'm dealing with hand injuries. I don't know if you can see it, but I just recently had surgery on this hand. So typing hurts, and I don't really like talking into a document. I mean, I know a lot of people have success with that. I don't like it. My brain doesn't flow the same through a microphone as it does on a keyboard.
Yeah, totally.
So,
I think you totally use different parts, at least I do, use totally different parts of my brain when I'm talking, even if I'm talking, telling a story versus thinking and typing, telling a story. I'm way more inside myself when I'm typing because it's like I go into a bubble where if I'm having to talk, I feel like I'm having to step outside of that bubble, and I don't like that. So yeah.
Right, and I'm listening to myself.
Oh,
I don't want to listen. I want it to go here.
Yes, totally. I totally relate. People are like, you need to go on TikTok. I'm like, I absolutely hate it. Like, I hate every aspect of having to do that. So no, I tried and I deleted it.
My wife wants me to do TikTok too. I always balk at that. Nope, not me.
Yeah, that's funny. So it's interesting because, I think you kind of always felt like that you liked writing, like, since you were writing poems at 8 years old. But that's a pretty big, I guess, life gap to actually writing, I guess, for almost like therapeutically or, for yourself versus wanting to write for the world. And what really, was it just your wife, or was there a point in your life that you were like, if I don't do it now, I'll never do it? Or what really got you to jump that bridge?
I think probably I could give credit to three people, I think, perhaps. But my wife always gets the first credit, period. I mean, she's been the biggest supporter, the love of my life, the person that keeps me moderately sane and keeps me from running around the neighborhood killing people, which could be good for stories, but probably not so good for, quality of life. But of course, then there's the author that I knew I was working with, and he was writing and having success at it, and I'm not. But nevertheless, he was having success and he was encouraging me to do it. And then I had read a book by someone who's become a friend of mine through another group, an Irish friend named John Patrick Hickey, called All You Have Is Now. And it's basically about goals, right? Of course, being in the corporate world, you always had all kinds of training on goal setting and SMART goals and all of those things. But all of the goals that I'd ever set and worked on were really work-related goals. What's the sales number? How are we going to increase this division? Or, it was all work-related. None of it was personal. My own personal goals were really more like, well, I'd like to do that someday, or I'd like to do that. There wasn't any set plan and no process to any of it. I think the combination of the three things, reading his book and saying, let me sit down and take what my wife's telling me to do and supporting me, what my friends telling me how to get started, and what this book's telling me, and how can I process these goals and kind of get things moving. And then, of course, after the first one, the Golem, right there, which is, which I said was like the greatest thing, the great start, and the worst thing. that was like, okay, this is kind of fun. So let me keep doing this. So, I mean, there's always a bazillion ideas. I've got idea books for, every time something pops into my head, or I hear somebody say some phrase that I'm like, I can do something with that phrase, I'm writing it down. So I think three people kind of coincided all at once, to get me in that direction. And then my hooks were in it, or its hooks were in me, maybe.
Yeah. It's interesting because I actually kind of had a similar path. I wrote journalism in my 20s and then wrote my first fiction story in my 30s. It's not in publication. And then I went through a divorce and was raising my kids, and I didn't write for 15 years. And then I turned 50. And it was like this moment of, and my husband's the same way. He's like, why don't you write anymore? You're such a good writer. You should really write. He was always kind of saying that. And then I hit 50, and it was kind of like that. Like when you read that book about now, I was like, if I don't do it now, I may not do it. And it opened the floodgates. And so that was really awesome because it's almost like it had been sitting in wait the whole time for me to just discover that. Did you feel the same way? Like as soon as you started it, it was like,
I did. And it seemed like it opened up so many more ideas too. Like, not that I didn't have a plethora of them already, but once it started flowing, I'm like, the ideas were just everywhere. So I find it hard to believe that some people are like, well, I just have no idea. So I'm like, hey, you don't, because I can't stop them from coming.
Yeah. Like, where do you get your ideas? I'm like, where don't I get my ideas?
Right.
Like,
It's everywhere. It just comes out of the air like breathing. So I think that's when you know, I think, you
yeah.
know, when it's something like, it's not so much something you want to do. It's like breathing. It's something you have to do,
Yeah.
you know, maybe.
Yeah. So why horror? Like, what drew you to that?
You know, that's an interesting question too, because I mean, I started out as a little kid. I'd spend all my allowance money going to the five and dime, if you remember those kinds of things.
Yeah, I do.
And I was reading mafioso, the Cosa Nostra, you know, kind of books. I mean, I would pick up a new one if I got allowance or money from mowing the lawn, I'd go pick one up. But then somewhere around 8 or 9 years old, a girl down the street who was babysitting my sister, younger sister, but she's maybe a year older than me. She handed me The Hobbit to read. So like, boom, straight into fantasy, right? And I stayed in the fantasy realm for a long time. I think the horror didn't start until I was in the army, you know, and then I started picking up the very first horror book that I remember kind of giving me the creeps and the willies a little bit, which remains my favorite horror book of all time, is kind of what helps kick it off. And that's T.E.D. Klein's book, The Ceremonies. So he didn't write very much, but I have everything that he ever wrote. And I think that's what, like, between that and my experiences, you know, I just kind of fell into the horror world.
So what type of horror do you write? I mean, there's like, you know, a lot of people don't know this, but horror is very broad. It's not just one thing. There's quiet horror, there's cozy horror, there's extreme, there's splatterpunk. Where do you fall in that range?
I don't even know how to describe that. I'm not splatterpunk, and I'm not extreme in gore. I like to describe it as more of a Twilight Zone-ish, Outer Limits kind of thing. Okay, if that makes any sense. A little bit of suspenseful, maybe supernatural or whatever. But the stories also range too, because, you know, I mean, each story is different. So like, I've got stories that involve like Cthulhu, older gods, and then I've got, of course, the Golem is, you know, a well-known type of creature in horror lore. So I mean, I've got different types of things. So, but I think it's more middle of the road, maybe psychological horror a little bit.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know how to describe it. I think of it more as a Twilight Zone kind of thing. And I think that, you know, having some sort of little twist somewhere at the end is where it makes it like the story doesn't really end, like it could potentially still be going on, is something that I like. And I always liked that in Twilight Zone. So, I mean, and of course I grew up watching like Alfred Hitchcock's Hour, you know, on TV. So, I mean, I'm kind of lean in that direction in general.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was literally today just reading your story for the anthology because I was going through and doing some edits and formatting, and you definitely have a psychological aspect to your stuff. You know, you're kind of in that, you know, the characters kind of in their experience, like you're in the car seat next to them as they're going through that. And I really like psychological horror. So that's like, I lean towards that a little bit myself. So when you decided to do horror and you kind of went on that, have you ever like looked at other genres, or do you tend to just stay in that, like that line, do you think?
I kind of tend to stay in that line. I had written some fantasy a long time ago. You know, at a rough 40 years ago. It's been a long time ago, you know, because I was reading so much fantasy. I mean, obviously Tolkien was, you know, and The Hobbit was like my mind blown, you know, as an 8 or 9 year old. But I read a lot of Elizabeth Boyer stuff. I don't know if you're familiar with her or not, but she was like a scholar on Icelandic and Norse mythology, these types of writings. And she wrote a lot of that. And of course, I was reading a lot of Dungeons and Dragons type fantasy stuff, Gary Gygax and people like that. So I was really into the fantasy stuff, but I was also into the, you know, Germanic Norse legends. So, you know, I took my hand at writing fantasy for a while, but that's not really, it doesn't flow,
Right.
you know. I mean, I like it, but it doesn't flow from me. So it didn't
Yeah.
quite fit. I am trying to work on like a couple of like a series with a serial killer, but it's serial killers, but it's a detective type of thing. So it's kind of more of a mystery thriller than horror. But it's taken longer because I can't type, and and because it's not as naturally flowing in me. It's like I'm kind of trying to train myself.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think we all tend to find, like, I'm cross genre, so I definitely write different genres, but they all kind of fall, I always say, into that dark fiction realm. Like, it just always kind of falls there. I can't really step out of it. Like, when I try to write something else, it always just reverts back to that. So I have an idea for a story and it's going to go this direction. And the story's like, yeah, you don't write that. You're writing this now. And so it ends up being that anyway. So it's interesting how we definitely find things that just fit with us. I don't write fantasy either. I may have fantasy elements in something, but I really just, I can't. Like, I admire it so much because, like, even just the world building in fantasy, I admire so much because I can't do it.
It is amazing.
Yeah.
And you're right about not sometimes being difficult stepping out of a genre. I mean, I get the same thing with poetry. Like, I can change genres in poetry, but I can never change style successfully, right? So I don't write a lot in terms of like modern poetry. I don't do haikus. My brain automatically reverts to an English meter with the 6/8 or an 8/8 count. And, the up and the down, the flow. It doesn't matter how I try to write. It always ends up that way, and I have to go back and change the beginning of however I started to write it in order to make it work.
Yeah, definitely. I think that no matter what, it's going to tell you what to do. It's just how it is. Like, it's like, yeah, that's what we're doing now.
No question.
So kind of going back to your first book, The Golem, and you said it's been out about 9 years, correct?
Yeah.
So let's kind of talk about your process for that. When you decided that you were going to publish this book and you put it out, if you could go back, other than the editor, because obviously we've talked about that, and change anything that you did to put it out, or change anything, within the kind of process itself, would there be anything that you would change?
I think I might change out some of the stories to make it more I don't know, cohesive, for lack of a better term. Because when people ask me about, what's this about, and you look at the stories, it's not all horror. I mean, there is like a weird kind of sci-fi story in there, and there's like a smaller, shorter fantasy story. So I think I would have honed it a little bit better from that perspective. I did pick stories that I liked that I already had, but I think I would have done a different job of putting them together in that particular collection. Other than that, of course, the editor is a big thing, but I don't know that I would. I mean, it was a learning experience. It's kind of like your first of doing anything really. I have the memories of doing that. I enjoyed the process of doing it. I learned from it, so maybe I do things different going forward, but I don't know that I would necessarily go back and change a lot from that process, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It does to me, because I tend to just own whatever I've done. I'm like,
right,
I did it. It's out there.
It happened. It was a process, and that's who I was at that period of time in the calendar, right? I can't change who I was in 2016, right? So who I am in 2025 it's a different person.
Yeah.
The core elements are still there, but there's a different person, right? So I can't take my 2025 me and say I'm going to superimpose you over my 2016 me.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I think age definitely kind of brings that wisdom, I think, too, is to accept who you were instead of being like, I want to erase it. You're like, this is who I was. I learned from this. This is my evolution. And I'm fine with that, too. So what was the reception like when you put that book out? What was the reception for people on your book?
Well, I guess maybe that's one thing that I would change, is learning how to market myself or my books, which I don't do, and I still don't do worth a darn. The reception was pretty decent, but of course it was friends and family type things, and people who were surprised that that I wrote something. You're in your 50s and you're writing something. Yes, I am, but here you go. I think the reception was pretty decent. I mean, I had some reviews that were negative based on not the story so much as the editing, and that's my fault. I mean, one, I hired the editor, and two, I didn't double check their work.
Yeah.
Right. I hired. I made the expectation incorrectly that they were going to fix my problems. I was naive.
Yeah. I think a lot of people are. I mean, I think a lot of writers think that they're going to take this manuscript that maybe they haven't done the work they should have done on it and hand it to somebody and they're going to fix it. And I do some freelance editing, and I've definitely received manuscripts like that where it's like, did you even read this after you wrote it? Like, right. Kind of like you just kind of gave it to me, and I'm not a miracle worker. So like, I think there is that element of like expectation, and we learn that, okay, yes, this is their job, but I have to work with them versus just kind of like, here, do this, and it's expensive. So to a degree, we want them to be able to do that, but also I think that it is a collaboration versus, it's not taking your car to the mechanic and having them fix something. It's really you in there with them going, okay, they say this and you talk about it, what you were trying to say, and they help you kind of through that process. But yeah, I think that's something definitely that is good for young writers to know, is that this is a process. You are going to be in it every single step of the way.
That mechanic thing is a very good analogy, because that's basically what I did. Let me drop this off with you and you do your thing. So, I mean, they did some editing in the sense of, hey, you need to straighten up these kinds of things. But one of the things that aggravated me the most is, despite how many spell checks and reads I'd been through, I thought that was part of their process, was finding those things, and they didn't. And then in the formatting, there's extra spaces, there's things that were weird, but you're right. I dropped it off with the mechanic. I didn't have the right mechanic, and I wasn't in there looking under the hood with them. I mean, so I blame myself, but I also had hired somebody to help me out, and that didn't pan out.
Yeah, I mean, I've been down that same road, I think, with, and I'm teaching classes now to people that are interested in publishing. And that's one of the things I touch on is like, one, first of all, just because someone says they're an editor doesn't really mean that they're an editor. There's different types of editors. There's different expectations. You have line editors, copy editors, development editors.
Right.
You need to know who you're talking to and what they are going to provide to you versus what they don't do. You also need to look at their expertise. You need to, again, a lot of people call themselves editors. It drives me crazy on Facebook. People are like, I'm an editor. They don't have anything to back that up. It's just they decided today they woke up and they're an editor. And it's like, no, that's not how that works. But yeah, I think as a writer, as an author, we have to really kind of go that extra step to ask those questions to understand what they're actually providing us. Because again, somebody might be really good at like line editing, but terrible at development editing, or vice versa. They might do the development editing, but they're not going to go through and catch your little mistakes. So those are still going to go to print. So yeah, I think that's a really important conversation for people to have and to understand. So you had that book out. I know you do, because I've worked with you. We're working on this anthology together, and you have other books that are short stories, correct? So you have books that are short stories and you are in anthologies, correct?
Yes, correct.
Okay. And how many of the short stories have you put out?
I have 3 books of short stories. The Golem is one. One of them is called All Things End, which I think is a weird title, but
a good title. Yeah.
I was thinking at the time, like, how do I say everything doesn't really end? So it's all things end with a question mark. It's like a question
all things
mark.
End?
Do all things really end?
You got a Ron Burgundy moment there.
Yeah, right. San Diego is German for whale's vagina, right? So the other one I put out last year is called Jamie's Closet, which is a collection of stories. And the fun thing about that book is that was kind of a labor of love. The title comes from my sister. Her name is Jamie. When we were little kids, my father was working for IBM, and they thought, well, one way we can save money is by moving people away from Alexandria, DC area out into the country in Virginia and open a factory out there, cheap land, cheap labor, whatever. And they moved my dad out there. So, of course, where do you think we're going? We're right out there with Dad. So we went from the projects in Alexandria to like farmland with everybody around us was like Mennonites, and we were in like a K to 12 one-room schoolhouse. We had no idea what was going on. Of course, we're little kids anyway, nothing whatsoever to do. So the entertainment was me telling my sister stories about things coming out of her closet. I mean, that's kind of where the title comes from. And a couple of the stories in there are related to our real life experiences, of course, embellished for the purpose of horror. But, you know, like the Shadow Man was probably, something that started with her in 1966 or something like that, and has developed over the years. So, I mean, that's kind of an homage to her, that particular book. And I've got another one that would have come out this year if I could have continued writing, but,
yeah,
things are just kind of on hold right now. It just so happens that when you were working on this anthology for The Devour the Rich, I had been fired from a job. They hadn't paid me for a couple of months prior to that. I only stayed on because, I was working in Maryland, and their rules are you can't get unemployment if you quit.
Right.
So I'm like, okay, but I also knew that in Maryland, the company's responsible to pay me whether they like it or not. Like they can take it out of the owner's house or yachts or land or whatever. So I'm like, okay, so I'll just ride this out. But of course, I still had a lot of anger and frustration that went into that story that you have.
Yeah.
It's coming out in the anthology in January. So, I'm looking forward to reading some of that because I've met several of the other authors, over time or, digitally online. Like, I've kind of followed Bobby Nash. I know he's in there. I haven't met him in person yet, but I feel like I know some of these people that I haven't quite met yet. And I'm looking forward to reading the rest of the stories.
Yeah, it's really, they're great stories. And, this came honestly kind of the same thing. I went through, I lost my job at the beginning of this year after I'd been like 6 years and built teams and all kinds of stuff to like make the company work really well. And then they laid me off, and I had a lot of anger myself. So I wanted to do this. And then I was like, it just kind of, I was like, came to me, like, I bet you there are other people out there that have stories to like, they want to write and tell. And I got so many great stories. I'm really excited about this anthology. And yes, I agree, Anita, Bobby is great. I know Bobby pretty well. We live not too far from each other, so we circle around at different events and see each other. And but yeah, I'm really excited about this book, and its timing couldn't really kind of be more perfect. So I think it's going to be really great.
It was perfect for me because I'd already written that story. So when you came out with your call, I'm like, all I got to do is work on it a little bit before I turn it in, right? So I just finished it. So I mean, since Bobby, tell him I want one of his Grover door hangers.
Okay, I'll tell him.
The drawings that he does, I mean, he makes those little door hanging things that he takes to trade shows. And I've seen him with either a Grover or a Super Grover. I don't remember which, but either one will do. Tell him.
Yeah. Well, Bobby, he probably will see this at some point. He's pretty involved with the Go Indie Now network too. So yeah. Bobby's another one that I really was excited to tell people about for the same reason. I was like, hey, you gotta know this guy. He's really great, and he's just a good guy too. Like when you meet him, you're just like, he's just a good guy. So yeah. He's. I'm glad he actually submitted a story to the anthology too, because I was hoping he would. So that was really cool.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. So kind of going back, let's talk about your writing process. Are you a pantser? Are you a plotter? Do things just kind of pop up and you got to scribble them down? Or how do you handle putting together a book?
That's, I want to say that I'm probably 75% pantser and 25% plotter. I actually, for the serial killer type books that I'm working on with you, I actually have this tool. I forget what it's called, Metro Cool or something like that, where I'm mapping things out. I mean, like literally mapping them out. Like if you had a crime scene and you're watching some TV show and they put a picture here and they draw a string over to this event, like I'm mapping these things out, characters, this, that, the other thing. But I find that a little bit more difficult in the sense that it kind of interrupts my flow if I'm trying to follow it. I mean, I know people that will write almost the entire outline. I mean, almost word for word, and then just sit down and start typing. For me, I have a problem doing that as much as other normal people because I feel like I lose the flow from my own self, and that somehow I feel like I'm squelching the character or what the story wants to say.
Yeah.
Like if I try to stick to, here's the plot, here's the plan, let me follow the plan. I feel like I need to bounce outside of that boundary line once in a while because I got to go wherever it's taking me. So it may not necessarily make sense to the reader, but it's making sense up here, and I got to follow the trail.
I can totally relate to that because I'm a huge researcher. Like I will research
yes.
details of the book to death, but I'm a pantser on everything else. Like so I know I'm going to have these elements. I'll research that and write everything down. And I got everything down, but then I'll sit down and have no idea where a chapter's going to go. I'll be like, let's see what happens. So totally relate to that because like I'm definitely a pantser, but I'm an organized pantser. So
Right. I can appreciate that. I'll have an idea where it wants to go, but sometimes I surprise myself where it ends up. I'm like, I didn't see that coming. That's not what I had planned in my brain.
Yeah.
Like, I'm going this way. We just turned right. Where the hell does this road go? Let's find out.
I love that though, because when I'm doing it, sometimes something will come out. Like I feel like I always joke that I feel like I'm just transcribing what the characters are doing. I'm not actually making them do anything. And sometimes like I'll sit down and think, okay, I'm going to kind of do this. But then the characters just go off on their own and create something that even I'm impressed by. I'm like, wow, that was really cool. I didn't know where that came from. And I love that aspect of writing because for me, that's why I like it. It's not a chore. It's exciting because it's kind of like watching a movie and you don't know where it's going to go, but you're writing it down the whole time to make sure you don't miss anything.
Exactly.
Yeah. So what do you see yourself doing going forward? Are you still looking at pretty much just writing short stories? Are you looking at more horror poetry or what is your like future?
I will have another book of horror poetry at some point, maybe next year, maybe the year after. I don't know. I mean, I've got stuff, but I don't have enough to do a complete book, I am going to continue to write short stories. I've got a couple of beta readers. I don't know where people find all these beta and ARC readers. So, I have a problem with that, but I got a couple of people that I trust that are, reading stories. So I'll continue to do that kind of thing. But I also am trying to work on the serial killer books, a series of things. I mean, I have the main character in mind, and I have the story ideas. But I don't know how long that's going to take. I wanted to already be done with one and working on the second one, and maybe release them very close in order to each other, like book one and book two, and then start working on book three, kind of thing.
And but a series of short stories about serial killers.
No, it'll be novels.
Okay,
it'll be 3 novels. I believe it'll be 3. Who knows? But I mean, I've already got from the plotting, planning side, the basic stories for the first 2. But I need to get my hands taken care of so I can get back to typing on a regular basis. So I don't know what my timeline is right now. I'm just kind of out there. I can type a little bit each day, and then once the pain starts, I have to stop.
Yeah. So you talked a little bit about struggling with marketing, and I when I first started doing this, I really struggled with marketing because I'm really introverted. So I really struggled. Even if I did events, I was never the person to go up and talk to other people. I was always the person to kind of sit behind the table. And I learned that didn't work. Like ultimately you have to connect. And so I practice scripts. I practice what I would say. I have to I have to mentally prepare myself to be social. And so I did. I learned certain things, and that's definitely helped with my marketing. What are some things that you find you do or that you're struggling with, I guess, with marketing? Because I know you said you struggle to find beta readers. Are you struggling with social media? Do you get out to events, or what are you doing for marketing?
I don't know. I would say from a Facebook perspective, I have a problem like promoting myself mentally. I have a problem promoting myself or promoting my books, and some of that comes from a lot of the authors that I follow seem like it's 12 posts a day about me, and I don't want to be that person, right? So, I mean, I kind of focus on, like every Tuesday I have stuff up that I call Tap a File Tuesday. Some graveyard that I've visited and what I've come across. Like today's post was Lizzie Borden's grave that I went to see, a couple of weeks ago. So I have certain days where I do certain things, and then every once in a while I'll throw up, hey, I'm going to this event or this book's coming out or whatever. But I don't really have a marketing plan per se. So uh, I do go to shows. I do several, and it's always uncomfortable. I'm an introvert as well. I have a tendency to do some of the bigger shows with a buddy of mine that lives nearby, Brian Nowak. We both did Scares the Care Author Con together. We did Horror on Main together. We do a handful of shows each year together, which makes it a little bit easier because I'm comfortable with him.
Yeah.
We're at the table together, so it's a little bit more comfortable. But I still don't really like getting out on the floor and trying to like talk to people. And part of that is also my own dislike of having people jump out from their table and try to track me down in the hallway, right?
100%.
So I'm trying not to be what I don't like happening to me. So of course that hinders me too. So
yeah, it's interesting because I'm the same way. Like I'll go to shows and I notice all the things I hate that people do. I'm like, oh, that is so annoying. And then I don't do them. So what I had to learn was, like obviously we learn as much from other people's mistakes or our mistakes as we do from successes. And so what I did start doing was really paying attention. And I actually keep a little journal with me when I'm at shows. And I'll watch what I like that people do and I'll note it, what they do. Most times what I like people doing stuff is more to do with passive marketing, not like, hey, buy my book, but they have deal on bundles or they have it presented in a certain way, or those are the things I've really gleaned from over the last few years to say like, and it's helped my marketing. But just as much I look at people and I think I can see when people are really annoying people. And I'm like, don't they realize they're annoying people? And they may even sell a book to them because the person's just trying to get away and they're like, fine. But that person probably isn't going to read it. They're going to have a bad taste in their mouth about that author. I'm like, regardless, you might think you somehow won, but you actually burned your own bridge. Right. And so I think that's a big part of marketing and online too. I mean, I see it too. The people that post, all they do is post about that. And I think people ultimately want to get to know us, right? Like, what is our motivation? I love what you're saying about like that Lizzie Borden's grave and stuff like that. That's fascinating. I'm very political, so I tend to make a lot of political posts, which can hurt me too, but I'm not going to shut up. So that's just, if you don't like it, don't follow me. That's
right. Understood.
But it's also important because it does show who I am and a lot of my motivations for why I write. And I think that is really important to do, even in person. I mean, like when you say that, I'm like, it'd be kind of interesting if you had like photos of graves and stuff at your table, because I would want to see that, It's like, oh, let me go look at this photo book real quick. Let's check it out.
What's interesting is Brian and I have been talking about doing like a coffee table book on some local interesting grave sites and things, So
yeah,
it hasn't happened yet, but we talk about it almost every time we get together. Like we need to get to working on that. And I think part of it's really just getting down to the research of what's the size of book that you would use and what kind of print would you use, because coming up with the writing and the pictures is the easy part.
Right.
Putting it together as a coffee table book, that's the hard part.
Yeah, I know a lot of photographers who put out books, and I can say that is the photography part of it's even a challenge, because getting a really good print quality of your photographs, they really struggle. A lot of them don't use KDP for that reason, because they said they just can't get good quality photographs, so they end up going through other presses for that type of stuff as well. So, and that's more expensive. So yeah, this balance of like, how much do you put into marketing financially that you're not getting back? And so that's, I think marketing, when I do these interviews and I talk to people, and their number one struggle is always marketing. Everybody struggles, I think, to a level, because kind of part of being a writer is being introverted, is being really good at being by yourself and creating a world. Then having to step into the real world is a lot more difficult. So yeah, like I said, for me, I had to create almost scripts in my head and things that I did. I don't like gimmicks. I absolutely detest, even if they work, I detest gimmicks. So I just immediately kind of went, no, on that one, I'm not doing anything gimmicky. But yeah, I think that you're not alone in that struggle at all.
Good.
And I'm glad you signed up for this show, because again, you're getting to know a whole new group of people. I love the Go Indie Now network. I met Joe, I think just online, and then eventually kind of got involved with this, and then met him at Multiverse, which is in Atlanta. And just really hit it off, and then eventually ended up hosting the show. So it is sometimes just building those relationships over time and connecting with people on some level. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I definitely like getting out and meeting people though, like you, people that I can learn from and experience a little bit, of this market and what's happening. Because I mean, when you're sitting in your room as an introvert and you're writing, you don't know what's happening out there in the marketplace. You can learn from your own mistakes, but it's a lot easier to learn from other people's mistakes than telling you what not to do or how they messed up, kind of thing. But I actually enjoy the relationships that I'm building inside the horror community. And of course, Scares That Care is, kind of jumps right out at you,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is a community that, for the most part, I won't say everybody, but for the most part, they all are very supportive of each other. They're very giving, and most of the authors, no matter how successful they are willing to give advice and try to help younger up and coming people. Nobody's like, no, all the gold is mine.
Yeah.
They're not dragons sitting on the hoard. They're like, come on in and enjoy the riches. Let me see if I can encourage you or help you in some kind of way. So that community is very unique, I think, compared to, businesses that I've worked in and other things that I've done in life.
Yeah. And I, for the listeners that don't know, Scares That Care is an organization. It's also called AuthorCon. They do an author event every year. Well, a couple times a year, one in St. Louis, one in Williamsburg. Mostly horror authors, but when I was there this year, there were some true crime and some thriller authors as well, kind of sprinkled in. But they raise money for charity, and so they give money to, I think it's one burn victim, one child with cancer, and one adult with cancer, I believe. And so
the adult is typically a woman going through breast cancer or something along those lines, mm-hmm. and a burn victim and a child. The burn victim could be adult or child. And then a child fighting something difficult like leukemia or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, so they basically they're a nonprofit and they take the money, and it was formed, I think, originally by Brian Keene, right? I think he was the original founder of Scares That Care.
Maybe. I don't know. Brian and Joe Ripple are kind of like the main two guys that I know.
Yeah, me too. But they take money that, from like the vendor fees and from different things, and they raise money at the event and around the event. And then that money is basically dispersed to these different families. So it's a really cool organization, and it's big. I mean, I only went this year, and it was the first time I'd been. I won't make it this coming year. But because it is far, it's like 9 hours. So like, that's a bit much. But I walked into that ballroom and all of those authors, and I was a little overwhelmed, I have to admit, because there was big authors. I mean, you had, Paul Tremblay, you had, Malfi, you had Grady Hendrix, who I also met at Atomicon. It brings in a lot of big names, but it also allows for up and coming authors and lesser known authors to really come in and kind of rub elbows and get to meet people. It's a really great event. And again, it's in Williamsburg in April, and I think St. Louis is in August, September?
Yeah, something like that. They just recently had it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Last year, were you there on opening night? It's on, I think, Friday night. They handed out checks.
Yeah. Friday night, when they brought us all into the auditorium, and then that was really cool.
So I mean, it's kind of cool seeing the charity in action, handing a $10,000 check to one of its recipients. You're like, okay. It's not like, you donate your money to somebody and you don't know whatever the hell happens to it. Like this charity, they're giving it away right in front of you. They're not hiding things, Yeah. And of course, the name, how can you not like Scares That Care, right? The horror community coming together. I think their tagline is fighting real monsters.
Yeah, I fight real monsters. I have a bumper sticker that says I fight real monsters. Yeah. So, and I had a child that I lost to cancer, so that meant a lot to me too. It wasn't just as an author, it was also because of what they were doing.
We had talked about that, and I had my son who had a stage 4 brain tumor too. Yeah. I mean, fortunately he lived, but I mean, I have his radiation mask hanging up in my office, and we went through all of that medical debt, which we still have some of, and it's been 20 plus years. So that's why this thing spoke to me. Like, I don't want other people to go through what we've been through. Right. Yeah. So I have to get behind this,
Absolutely. Yeah, they do great work. And I have to say, a lot of the events that I do, Multiverse included, they always have a charity that they raise money for. And I love that because I think ultimately as an author, we do have big hearts and we do want to support other things. So it matters to us that we're supporting something that is supporting something else, you know? So
Right.
I think that's really important. But yeah, I wish I could go this year. I love the event. I think it's a really amazing event. Unfortunately, I won't be there this year. Just life kind of changed for me this year,
Understood.
you know, but I still support it 100%. And if people can go, you know, I definitely think you should go. And you get to see some really, like I said, I was kind of impressed. I walked around a little awestruck that first night. I was like, wow, there's like some names here. You know?
I felt the same way. And of course, one of the guys that I really like sits out in the promenade area is Ronald Kelly.
Oh yeah,
And I'm like, and I sit down and I get to talk to Ron like, you know, like he's talking to me like we're just regular good old buddies from the hills of Tennessee. I'm like, this is awesome. I'm starstruck, but hey, he's real.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
He's real. He's a real person. I'm like, this is pretty awesome.
Yeah, he's awesome. I mean, we're friends on Facebook too, and he's always just kind of giving in, you know, his like his wisdom that he's learned over the years, and he's always really open to newer authors and helping them kind of, you know, get through that forest of what it means to be an author. Yeah, I think there's some really amazing people, and I have to say, especially when you get into like indie authors and things like that, everybody really supports one another. Everybody really wants to lift each other up and get each other like through, you know, through that. And that's really important, I think, too, because it's not just, you know, us. We do sit in our houses by ourselves, by our screens, but there is really a really tight knit community across the board. I think in indie and smaller kind of authors, and not just horror, but like in everything, there really is this kind of like tight knit community that keeps you going when you do feel isolated or you do feel alone. You can reach out and someone's like, hey, I've been there. I mean, I remember the first time I was like, one of my first events, and I was like, how do people do this as an introvert? And RJ Rawls, you know, who started Books of Horror, he was like, oh, totally, this was me. This is what, you know, this is what I did. And that really helped me because I was struggling with events. Like I just didn't want to have to sit behind that table at all. And so like talking to people like, they were like, hey, let me help you with this. This is what I did. You know, it really matters. All right, let's see. Well, we're getting down on time. I usually do the wheel. So we'll do one spin of the wheel. Because what they say with the wheel is I forgot to fill it. So we will spin a wheel. You'll see here. I'll show you in a second. So let me share my screen and then we will pull up the wheel. It's just fun. And this used to have like 30 different things on it. And over the show, I have been slowly dwindling it away, and I totally forgot to add any today. So we only have 3 to choose from. And so we'll spin the wheel, whatever lands on. We'll talk about whatever first that relates to you. And I usually chime in as well. So let's go ahead and spin.
Okay.
Oh, first crime.
Yay. First crime. Wow, I don't even know. I'm sure there was lots of little shoplifting things going on here. But I'll tell you, the first one that kind of that comes to my mind is I had bought a Beatles album, Meet the Beatles, or With the Beatles. I don't remember. It was the American version. One of them's the British release, one of them's the American release. I don't know. And I had one of those little portable record players that you like plug into the wall kind of thing, for those of you old enough to know what a record player is. And I was sitting out in the backyard at my parents' house like on a Saturday, and I'd used like all my allowance money and stuff to buy this album. And I sat out there listening to the music and just kind of sunbathing, like before we knew you're not supposed to sunbathe, right? And the sun warped the LP. Right, because I kind of fell asleep, the sun warped it. I put it back into the envelope and walked back to the 5 and Dime and said, hey, this album that I bought, it's all warped and messed up. So I exchanged it for a new one, and then I learned not to play my album in the sun outside. But I guess maybe that was my first crime that I remember.
I think that's fraud. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm the one that caused the damage and the warping. But like, you're going to be the one to pay for it, Mr. Store Man. You know.
Yeah.
So yeah, there you go. There's my proud moment from the 60s.
That's so funny. You know, and I think shoplifting is probably everybody's first, for the most part. And so yeah, I definitely shoplifted. But for me, I have 5 older brothers and 4 male cousins. So I was the only girl out of 10 grandchildren.
Wow.
And they always had really terrible ideas. I could list a bazillion things that they had me do that was illegal over time. But the one I remember is the bright idea that we lived on Long Island and people have bungalows, and they have like bungalows they don't use. So like they store them or they only use them for the summer or whatever. And the bright idea was to go and break into these bungalows and steal things. So we did. We were breaking in and then we got caught. And so we ran into the woods and we were hiding behind trees. And we got caught by one of the homeowners. And she's like, I see you in there. Get out of there. Come out. And we did. We came out and we got in trouble, but didn't stop us. We still broke into bungalows. But yeah, that was probably my first official crime outside of shoplifting. I think shoplifting is a crime, but it's also like not a crime. It's like a rite of passage to childhood. So,
right.
That's my logic. I'm going to stick to it.
There you
go. All right, let's spin it one more time because I am, like I said, running out of things here. So we'll spin it one more time and see what we have. We just have the 2. So what's it going to be? Should be first scare. That'd be a good one. All right, first scare.
First scare. Huh. That's a hard choice. I think I know what my first scare is from a reading perspective, but I'll say my first scare probably from a movie perspective was going to see The Exorcist when it first came to theaters, right? And it was scary, but what was even scarier is as you were entering, I mean, back then, whatever year this was, 72, 73, I don't remember. It's been a long time. They were handing out barf bags like you see on airplanes. Like it was making people across the country so sick that they were vomiting in theaters. So, of course, it doesn't do that to me now. It didn't do that to me then, but I'm like, man, this thing has got to be bizarre if it's like that. So I think that was my first scare, and I think it was Reagan like crawling on the ceiling that was like, whoa, hold up, what's going on there, you know?
Can you imagine how much that barf bag would be worth now? Like if you
right? Who knew? They'd put that on eBay somewhere.
Oh my
right?
gosh, you just like pay for your retirement.
Right.
That'd be amazing.
They literally used to hand them out when you were getting your ticket and going into the theater, at least locally. I don't know if they did nationwide or not, but locally they did.
Oh my God, I love that. That's so cool. Yeah, I was trying to think of my first scare, and obviously like we were in the drive-in age. My parents' logic was, don't want to pay for a babysitter. We're going to go watch the movie, give you guys some pillows and blankets while we watch a horror movie. So I definitely saw, like, I remember seeing, like, I think it was Lake Placid or something, you know, at a young age, and like blood on the rocks and things like that. And like that terrified me for sure. But I feel like because I was raised in a time where like we kind of were just exposed to things, like they just, like I was a 70s kid. So you were 60s, I was 70s. They just really didn't like protect our psyches at all.
No. I mean, now that you mention that, it brings back the memory. My mom did that with me. My dad hated horror movies, and he didn't like drive-ins. So, you know, as far as I knew, I grew up in the drive-in theater, right? I started before I even knew what a drive-in was. You know, same thing, bundled up in the back seat. And now that you've mentioned that, I remember my wife makes fun of me and I make fun of her too because of a movie that scares her. You know, that I think, really, that's what scared you? But she makes fun of me for this. There was some movie that was in black and white, and I don't even know what the name of the movie was, that my mom had taken me to the drive-in. And it was like Circus Freaks, and there was something, it was like a part snake, part boy. Scared the crap out of me as a little kid. And, you know, and my wife's like, what's your scariest movie? Oh, yeah, whatever that snake boy is.
Whatever that was, yeah.
I'm in my 60s, and I don't want to see that snake boy right now.
It's so funny because we were talking about that, like what scares us as kids. And when I was a kid, there was this commercial, and it was like this creature that puts spots on your dishes, but he was like this little green creature. And I would run out of the room screaming every time that commercial came on. Like, so when as an adult, I'm like, how scary was that? So I looked it up. I'm like, really isn't that scary? But I could see, you know, like why I was scared, because it was scary. But yeah, definitely. I think that may have influenced a lot of like my writing later.
Right.
Terrified as a child all the time. So yeah. Awesome. Well, it looks like we're about to run out of time. So let me have you once again tell everybody a little bit about your work and where they can find you.
Okay, well, thanks for having me today. It's been fun talking to you. My name is Bryn Grover. I can be found mostly on Facebook, Bryn Grover Author or Brian's Quill. But I have a website quillgroupllc.com. And of course, I have an author page on Amazon where you can pretty much find everything. So just look me up on any of those. My spelling is weird. You can see the spelling's weird. So Bryn with a Grover at the end of it, and you got the right guy.
It's unique, yes.
Yeah.
And Bryn will have a story in our upcoming anthology, Devour the Rich, which is due to come out on January 21st, 2025. So definitely check him out there as well. And again, I really appreciate you coming on. This was a great talk. And thank you to everybody who's tuned in. We really appreciate you. And and it's always time for Go Indie Now.